Okay, we are recording. I'm joined today by Elizabeth Scarbrough, who is assistant teaching professor at Florida International University. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So what we're talking about today is your work on ruins. And so I'll start off with just the basic question which is, what are we appreciating when we're appreciating a ruin?
Okay, great. So I think most people who talk about ruins do think that what we're appreciating is something that's distinct from what I refer to as its architectural cousin, like what it once was. So we're not just appreciating the architectural style or what it once looked like in its, I don't know, in the height of its unified state. There's something having to do with the decay. Some people talk about how function of the space has changed. I think the important thing about ruin appreciation and how important ruins are compared to other objects is that they have these what I'll call a tripartite structure. There are three different things. We can reimagine what the ruin once looked like. We can engage with what's on the site right now, and we can imagine what it's going to look like in the future. And the fact that it's in the process of decay, so the fact that it's changing, helps us to focus our minds on that, the past, the present, and the future. And so I think that the fact that ruins are in the process of decay is really important. And that will have implications for how we preserve them. So if you think that a ruin is aesthetically important because it's in the process of decay, then you might say, okay, we get to arrest the decay a little bit, but if we were to kind of preserve it perfectly where it is right now, and not allow it to decay anymore, then you're losing something aesthetically important about it. So the fact that it's an object in transition, the fact that it has a lifespan, I think is one of the things that allows us to focus on some properties rather than others. And that this transitory nature is really important. And I'll just say one other thing about it is that I think with the exception of maybe follies, which are like sham ruins, most ruins were unplanned. So unlike an architectural structure that has an architect or an author, these are structures that have been changed in ways that were not by the hand of man. And so that's another important aesthetic feature, is the way in which these objects change in unplanned ways. And so unexpected things happen that you wouldn't find in other objects of aesthetic appreciation.
Okay, so we lose something if we attempt to preserve a ruin, right? If we attempt to sort of freeze it in time. What is it that's lost? I mean, okay, we lose the transitory nature, right? We sort of fix it where it is now. It's not going to decay further. What's lost there in terms of appreciating the object?
Yeah. So I think if we want to take this notion of being in time seriously, and myself and others who talk about ruins do talk about the way it can elicit the sublime and all this, memento mori, the fact that we're in time and yes, you too will die. When we preserve it in a time slice, I think you can still get some of those features. But what you're losing is the fact that the next time you go to visit it in a ruin that's still a ruin, it's going to look different. Right. So every time you encounter this object, if you are allowing it to have a lifespan, you get to appreciate different aesthetic qualities. So every visit to the castle every 5 years, it's going to look different and allow me to have, I think, richer and more fruitful aesthetic experience around that notion of memento mori and the sublime. That's not to say that you can't have that sort of experience with something static in time, because I think you can. But I don't think it's as powerful as the next time I come here, it is not going to look like this. And that's very much like life. That's very much like our bodies, how we age, how the earth ages, how things are, I think, intended to change. And so many of our objects of aesthetic appreciation are static. And so having this class of objects that sits somewhere between the artifactual and the natural, it's like a hybrid of the two, I think foregrounding the fact that change is inevitable is really important. So I think you do lose a little, not all of it, but I think you do lose a little bit of that.
Okay, and so in a case where, say, the experts agree that in 5, 10 years, this ruin is going to completely crumble, it's going to completely disappear. In that sort of case, do you think preserving it would be worthwhile?
So I don't think we want to say that all architectural structures that are now in ruins we should allow to continue to ruinate. I think there are good reasons, historical reasons or archaeological reasons to preserve things in situ as is, especially if there's still information, scientific information you want to gather from them. Um, so I think it's only going to be a very small class of objects we allow to ruinate. And I think we allow things to ruinate for many reasons. One reason could be this aesthetic appreciation. Uh, and in that small group of objects, then I think you say, yeah, it's now a heap of rubble, and it's going to be very unclear, right? When something is a ruin, then a heap of rubble, or then a ghost structure, right? People talk about that, or a trace of something that was once there. Uh, but I think that's kind of lovely. The fact that it's going to be gone and at some point will be a ghost or a trace. And I don't think we have that with many of our artifactual aesthetic experiences.
Okay, so in appreciating a ruin, right, some people talk about being in touch with the past, right? That this object is here, it's sort of speaking to us from the past. Do you sort of think in those terms as well? Like there's something about being in touch with this old object, the fact that it's old and the fact that a replica of that object couldn't give us, an authentic experience of the world as it once was or something of that sort. Do you
Yeah,
feel?
so Korsmeyer, I think you're referring to
Yeah.
things in touch with the past. She has this transit, the transitive property of touch, that I'm touching something that was once touched by people in the past, and that's really important to the experience of the genuine. And I buy that. I actually do think engaging with real objects uh, puts us in a headspace where we can imagine in a way that's I don't know, it feels richer than if you were to find out, oh, that's a replica. I think replicas can be great for certain things. I think they can be great, again, for scientific understanding, or when something's too precious, like Lascaux Caves, too precious to go into, you can give someone an approximate experience. But the being there-ness, and Korsmeyer focuses on touch. But I think, the other thing about ruins is that there are all these different senses employed. So it's not just touch, but smell, and the way you can move your body through these structures that are no longer kind of fit for human. They're not made for us to walk around anymore. They're now bumps and fissures, and we will stumble. You can also hear the critters that have now inhabited the space. Maybe I know some archaeologists taste things. They put things on their tongue to see whether or not it was pottery or something else, right? So you get to use all of your senses. But the focus on touch, I do think she's right that there's something important about I'm standing in the place where this thing happened, or I'm standing in the very spot where this for many, many years has stood. It is a testament to time that this thing has been able to stand, and very sad that it might not be able to stand very much longer. I loved when I was little going to recreations. I went to Colonial Williamsburg. I had I think it was called the Patriot Pass. Like I would go every year. And Carcassonne, like there's real value in those experiences too. I think educational value, but it's just of a very different sort than being in the spot where ... So yes, I buy the account.
Yeah, and I mean, I think sort of being in touch with the past, touch is key, but I think you're right that other sense modalities are involved there. And so, not on ruins, but I collect old records, right? And I don't collect reissues. I don't buy new albums that come out on vinyl. I want old records from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? And they have, not merely for the tactile qualities, although that's, I think, essential, but like the smell of the thing, right, is different than a newly pressed record. And that sort of figures into the aesthetic experience of the music. So yeah, I'm totally in line with what Korsmeyer and you were saying there. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on old records?
Well, I had a huge collection of old records and I had to pare it down all my times moving. I also think we like to think about objects who once had them. So I have my father's old record collection and a copy of Sticky Fingers from when I was a little kid that I ripped open because I wanted to see what was underneath the zipper. And if I hadn't done that, it would be worth a lot of money today.
Yeah.
But the fact that it has, you know, part of my personal history and belong to someone, or even these objects, if you buy antique jewelry, I think we think about the journey that these objects have taken throughout time and what it must have taken for them to persist. And because we think about that, not just reconstructing where they once were, I do think it's nice to think, well, where is this going to be after I die? If I have an antique ring that my great aunt gave me, where is that going to be in 2 or 3 generations from now? What is it going to look like? What is the life of objects? In your records, the same way. Like, let's hope you don't leave them in the backseat of a car,
Yeah. No,
which I've done to get
oh,
warped.
sorry.
But they, you know, they are also precious objects that require temperature control and require not to be stacked certain ways. And so
Yeah.
they have a lifespan too.
Yeah. And I mean, the fact that, some of the records that I have are like from the 70s and they're in near mint condition, right? That means someone took care of these things for years and years and years and years. They placed the stylus very carefully on the tracks, that, they clean them, et cetera, right? Whereas, most old records aren't in that sort of almost pristine state, right? Cool. So let's get back to ruins, away from my interests and back more into yours. How about things like battlefields, right? Where, we're appreciating something, right? But you're not appreciating so much architectural objects, buildings, or so forth. It's just like the field, right? People were here, people in the field. But what's going on when we appreciate battlefields?
So I've thought about battlefields a little bit because I was a kid who was dragged to battlefields. And I do think dragged. And especially in the United States, there are all these, battlefields. I shouldn't say especially in the United States. In the United States and everywhere else, there are these battlefields that have very charged meanings in terms of cultural heritage. The Civil War looming large still hundreds of years later in the South, and people visiting these sites. And so I think with all cultural heritage, including architectural ruins, they can be used for nationalistic purposes. They can be used for all sorts of nefarious political purposes. People make meaning of the site in very different ways. As a child looking at a battlefield, I think one thing is just looking at the natural beauty, because as you said, most of them don't have structures. Maybe there's a fort, but you get to kind of survey the land, and the land has been kept. I can show my example. The land has been kept to try to look similar to what the battlefield looked like. So this is here. That's my Gettysburg example. And Gettysburg is a great example where the National Park Service took down trees that were over 100 years old to make the battlefield look more like the battlefield. And they trucked in cannons so people could have this experience of being there. But again, it's like a very visual experience of being there. I think that's weird that we've kind of, again, tried to keep these spaces in this time slice of like, this is what the battlefield must have looked like. But when I think the average person goes to a battlefield, they are moved sometimes about the loss of life on the site, the sacrifices that people made for causes that they thought were just or unjust. And I think this whole picture gets complicated when it serves as the sort of memorial to remember the dead. So a lot of architectural ruins are places where people died. If you think of shipwrecks, that's I think an obvious case where mostly it's a place where it's a graveyard. So not only is it a ruin, but it's also a graveyard. In the case of battlefields, I think it does elicit some of the same, I'm standing on the place where men have died and there is nothing left of them. And think about the changes on the site right now. And so that's why I think it's a little bit weird to keep them looking like the battlefields that they must once looked like. I kind of like the idea of if trees had been, grown on that site, you can't imagine it as a clear battlefield. It'd be like, wow, look, nature really has taken over the space. Time has moved on. The march of time is just left these men behind. But I think that it's important to people to still think of it as a memorial site, and that's why they haven't allowed the march of time to happen. As a kid, I don't think kids care as much about memorials, or I didn't. And I didn't really care about the history. I thought it was pretty, right? They're usually sites that are designed for contemplation. So there'll be markers and such for us to look. And it's a good opportunity for people, even if they don't care about the history, to take a moment out and look on a beautiful view shed, walk around the space, engage with kind of a cultivated version of nature. And I think the National Park Service has done a good job of trying to do that there are these many different ways you can engage while still keeping it available for people who want to mourn the dead.
So is that cannon, is that an old cannon that was just dragged there from, it wasn't used at the battle. It was just, maybe it wasn't even used during the Civil War, but it's from that time period, right? So what's going on with that cannon?
So the cannon is, they tried to get cannons that were old, but obviously they didn't have all the remnants from this particular battle. And yeah, they trucked them in. And again, I think it's because there is this primacy of the visual in, philosophical aesthetics. Obviously, there's still the primacy of the visual. And I think in our everyday lives too, that people wanted to get this shot. They wanted to see, Instagram or whatever. They wanted to see the rolling hills. And it is beautiful with the cannon there to signal that it is in fact a battlefield. So I think, yeah, they're trying to make you remember or reconstruct, do that imaginative reconstruction of like, this is what it must have looked like X number of years ago. Which again, wouldn't be my preference. My preference, I understand the need to have spaces to mourn, but if it was not a mournful space, I think my preference would be to let nature take its course and not have taken down those 100-year-old trees.
Yeah, and that cannon isn't authentic, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
so
it's of the period,
it's
but it
of the
wasn't
period.
of the battle.
So
Yeah.
you could touch it and maybe have that experience if I'm touching an object that was from that time period. But again, yeah, it's not from that space. And this happens often all over the world where people will try to get objects from that time period and maybe rebuild ruins with, oh, the stones are original to the time period, but not original to this place. So it's an approximation. I think they're trying their best. Obviously, there's a desire for it. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, again, the National Park Service serves the public. So if there's a desire for it, I understand doing it. And I think that they have been transparent about doing it. So they will let you know that these are not from the battle. And that makes a difference. They're not trying to deceive anyone. But I think a lot of it is for the pretty picture.
Yeah, it's for the selfie, basically.
For the gram. Yeah.
Here I am in front of this cannon that was not used in this battle, but at least it's not a replica.
Yeah.
I guess. So, I mean, sort of the point there, I guess, is that this site serves multiple functions at the same time, right? It serves as, this historical object, right, that's meant to serve historical education. It's this sort of memorial object, right? This memorial space, not really an object. And it also has these aesthetic qualities. And so you have those three, and there are probably more sort of dimensions to this space competing with one another. And what your thought is that it would probably be better if they focus more on the aesthetic, the ruin, the oldness of the place by letting the trees grow, not cutting them down, not manicuring the space.
Well, I think it would be more authentic to the space if we're talking about authenticity. And again, I think it is just the primacy of the visual that they're trying to make it look like something. But if we're just talking about the continuation of original material, well, this is nature and nature changes. So having trees grow up on that site seems like more continuous of the matter of the space. But again, yeah, because it's a National Park Service or whenever we're talking about ruins, power and money and how disparate populations want to use the space obviously are really important. This space also, people walk around it. They use it for exercise. They use it, right? These are spaces that are useful for people. And so if people want to use it in this way, I think that's great. My proposal is just supposed to be, I want to put it on the table. And if a community wants to reject it, we don't really care about the aesthetic appreciation of ruins. Great, but put it on the table, because I do think people, it's, it's an 18th century hangover, but that was a long time ago. So we've had several hundred years in a certain tradition of admiring these objects in these ways. And so to just think about those sorts of properties and why we value them, put them on the table, and then if communities want to reject, let them reject.
Okay, great. So I think on that note, we'll wrap it up. So thank you so much, Elizabeth. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.